Madam President, just listening to my good friend from Utah speaking here, and he is a good friend of mine, and others who've been speaking for the last hour. Boy, memories are short around here. Really short. I mean, really short. Forget about the attention span. Memories are really short. How soon we forget that at the end of the Clinton years, after we had worked with President Clinton to pass measures that brought in more revenues, that kept our spending under control, we had 4 years of balanced budgets. 4 years. Not only of balanced budgets, budget surpluses. When President Clinton left office, he left George W. Bush the biggest surplus ever in our history. CBO said if we just continued on with the policies that we had, we'd have paid off the national debt by 2010. Well, what did the Republicans do? They come riding into town. 2001, they got the White House, they got the Senate, they got the House. What'd they do? They took that surplus we had and said, hey, we got to give this to the wealthy. We got to have tax cuts for the wealthiest in our society, and that's what they did. And how did they do it? They snuck it through on something called reconciliation, budget measure, which means that you can't filibuster it, and it only takes 50 votes. That's what the Republicans did. They squandered it to give more to the wealthiest in our society. And look what's happened since then. And then we had 2 unpaid-for wars. 2 unpaid for. George Bush got those, in those wars, don't pay for them, we'll just borrow it from China, borrow it from other countries. And then a new prescription drug benefit, unpaid for, we'll just borrow more money. And now these same Republicans who ran up the deficit, squandered the surplus, are now saying that we've got to balance the budget on the backs of the middle class. That we've got to balance the budget on those who already are hurting so much. But no, we can't raise revenues on the wealthy. Oh, no, can't do that. Well, as I said, Madam President, memories are short. They all want a balanced budget now. Why don't we just do what we did under the Clinton years? Let's have the same kind of economic policies that we had then. And then we'll have balanced budgets. But no, not my Republican friends, no. They say they want to limit government spending to 18% of GDP. I like to ask, where does that number come from? Why is it 18%? Why isn't it 18.5%? Why isn't it 17.75%? Why isn't it 19.23%? Where does 18% come from? Madam President, let me tell you where this comes from. The last time that the federal government was 18% of GDP spending was 1967, before Medicare really got underway. So, read between the lines. What the Republicans are saying, if they could get that down to 18%, we can do away with Medicare, which is what they want to do anyway. Republicans want to do away with Medicare. If you can get GDP, the federal government's role of spending down to 18%, you're back where you were in 1967, guess what? We can get rid of Medicare and turn it back over to the private insurance companies. That's what the Ryan budget did, that's what the Republican budget did, and that's what they all voted for. So when they tell you about 18% of GDP, think Medicare. Think Medicare. Goodbye, Medicare. That's what they're after. Madam President, we've reached a point of maximum danger in our fragile economic recovery. We're mired in the most protracted period of joblessness since the Great Depression. Businesses reluctant to invest and hire for the simple reason there's not sufficient demand for goods and services. Largely because, why? So many people are unemployed, 20 million. People are mired in debt. And even those who are working are insecure about their employment. So for most Americans in the middle class and lower income, this is still a deep recession. So I have come to the floor repeatedly in recent weeks to warn against the folly of Washington's current obsession with making immediate draconian cuts to the federal budget, something that by its very nature will drain demand, reduce growth, and destroy jobs. Federal Reserve Board Chairman Ben Bernanke warned just last week, and I quote, "In light of the weakness of the recovery, it would be best not to have a sudden and sharp fiscal consolidation in the very near term. It would be a negative for growth." Here in the Washington bubble, many, especially those on the opposite side of the aisle, have persuaded themselves that the biggest issue is the budget deficit. But outside the Beltway, outside of Washington, Americans are most concerned with a far more urgent deficit: the jobs deficit. The jobs deficit. I'm also concerned, Madam President, about a third deficit that I think we have here: a deficit of vision. A deficit of vision. I'm disturbed by our failure to confront the current economic crisis with the boldness and the vision that earlier generations of Americans summoned in times of national challenge. Our Republican friends reject the very possibility that the federal government can act to spur economic growth, boost competitiveness, create good middle-class jobs. That's their ideological position, and they're sticking to it, even in the face of contrary facts. It's based on a profound misreading, or perhaps non-reading, of American history. You know, as Americans, we pride ourselves on a robust free enterprise system. But there are some things, big national undertakings, that the private sector simply is not capable of doing. At critical junctures, going back to the beginning of our republic, the federal government has stepped up to the plate. We've acted decisively to spur economic growth, foster innovation, create jobs. So let's go back and let's do a little analysis of our history. The Founding Fathers are very much in vogue these days, so let's go back to that time. Let's go back to Alexander Hamilton, a hero of the Revolutionary War, our first Treasury Secretary. In 1791, Hamilton presented to Congress his landmark Report on Manufactures, a set of policies designed to strengthen our new economy. His plan was adopted by Congress. It included tariffs to raise revenue and to protect our domestic manufacturing base. Hamilton's plan was an historic success. It was echoed several decades later by Congressman Henry Clay's famous American System. In the burst of nationalism following the War of 1812, Clay advocated for major new federal investments in infrastructure. Of course, at that time, he didn't call it infrastructure. He called it, quote, internal improvements. Clay led the Congress in raising new revenues to finance subsidies for roads, canals, bridges, projects designed to expand commerce, knit the nation together. One of those internal improvements was the Cumberland Road, our first truly national road. Began in Maryland, stretched over the Alleghenies more than 600 miles to Illinois. It was Henry Clay of Kentucky and other Westerners who pushed to extend the road from Wheeling, West Virginia to Columbus, Ohio. But again, go back and read your history. Clay was bitterly opposed by those who said the federal government couldn't afford to build the roads and canals and had no business doing so. Sounds familiar from what I'm hearing on the other side of the aisle today. History shows that the naysayers were wrong on all counts. The Cumberland Road opened up the West to settlers in commerce and development. Of course, the most visionary 19th century advocate of federal investments to spur economic growth was a Republican, the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. Despite the disruption of the Civil War, Lincoln insisted on moving the nation forward through bold federal investments and initiatives. In 1862, he signed the Pacific Railway Act, authorizing huge federal land grants to finance construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, one of the great technological feats of the 19th century, and to produce the rails here in America rather than shipping them in from England. He enacted a steep tariff on foreign steel in order to jumpstart the American steel industry. Lincoln did much more. He created the Department of Agriculture by to do more research, distributed free land to farmers, used government agents to promote new farm machinery and agricultural techniques. As a proud graduate of Iowa State University, I note that Lincoln also dramatically increased higher education by creating the land-grant college system. Taken together, these initiatives during Lincoln's presidency, and I remind you, he was doing all this during the Civil War. It had a transformative effect on the U.S. economy. We created new industries, expanded opportunity, created millions of new jobs, and he did this despite the fact that the federal government was deeply in debt and running huge deficits. Imagine that. Abraham Lincoln. These Republicans always go to their Lincoln Day dinners. Why don't they start talking about what Abraham Lincoln did to spur economic growth and create jobs in our country at a time when our federal government was in a deficit? It's almost humorous to imagine how the Republicans would have reacted to Lincoln's agenda. They would have attacked him, I'm sure, as reckless and irresponsible. They'd whine that we're broke, we can't afford to invest in the future. I'm sure that the Tea Party contingent, the Republican Party, would have demanded that Lincoln be expelled from the Republican Party. Madam President, moving into the 20th century, time and again, the federal government has acted with boldness and vision to accomplish big things that was simply beyond the capacity of the private sector. During the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, with the private sector paralyzed by the Great Depression, the federal government responded with an astonishing array of initiatives to restart the economy, restore opportunity, create jobs. The list is far too long, but I would mention rural electrification, the Civilian Conservation Corps and what they did to plant trees and greenways all over America, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which brought opportunity and power to the deeply impoverished Appalachia, Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee Dam, bringing power and water across the Southwest and the Northwest. Millions of unemployed Americans, including my father. You come over to my office, I'll show you my dad's WPA card, Works Progress Administration. Got a job with dignity thanks to the Works Progress Administration. They built thousands of infrastructures around our country, roads and dams and schools, bridges, many of which we're still using today 8 decades later. I would point out one project my father worked on, Lake Aquabi State Park near Indianola, Iowa, which my father worked on with other WPA people to help build. We're still using it today. By the end of the Second World War, wartime investments by the federal government had created an industrial colossus. Now, FDR and Truman were followed then by a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower. Now, what did he do? Did he pull the plug on all this? Well, let's look at history. Eisenhower, a proud Republican, was determined to move America forward. He championed at a time when the federal deficits continued into the 1950s from World War II. Because the national debt grew so big during World War II, we were still in debt and during the 1950s. Now, what did Eisenhower do? Did he say we got to retrench, we can't do anything? No. He championed one of the greatest public works projects in American history, the construction of the interstate highway system. The National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956 ensured dedicated federal funding to build a network today that encompasses over 46,000 miles of highways. A 1996 study of the system concluded that, quote, the interstate highway system is an engine that has driven 40 years of unprecedented prosperity and positioned the United States to remain the world's preeminent power into the 21st century, end quote. Well, you know what? I'll bet the Tea Party contingent of today's Republican Party would probably have tried to run Dwight Eisenhower out of the Republican Party. Madam President, in more recent times, the federal government has funded and spearheaded scientific discovery and innovation that's had profound impacts on our economy, created millions of high-value jobs. Now, I know my time is limited. I just want to mention a couple. It was the federal government, specifically the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency called DARPA, that created the internet. No, I'm sorry, my young friends, it was not Google, and it was not Microsoft, although Bill Gates built a great empire. It was the federal government that created the internet, making possible everything you get from email to social networking, need I mention tweeting, and the World Wide Web. This has revolutionized the way we do business, not only here, but around the globe, and has created untold millions of jobs. It was not a private company. It was the federal government amassing the money that people pay in taxes to create the internet. Federal researchers at this same agency also created the Global Positioning Satellite System, GPS. When you get in your car, you want to know where to go, and you follow all that. You think Garmin invented that? No. But the Garmin company and all the rest of them, I shouldn't single one out. There's a lot of competitors out there. They're making the instruments. They're hiring people. The private sector is doing what it should do. But it was the federal government that created the Global Positioning Satellite, and it was taxpayers' dollars that put those 24 satellites in orbit and still keep them operating today. Researchers at NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, have made dozens of technological breakthroughs over the year, everything from microchip to CAT scanner technology. And of course, a discussion of the federal government's role in stimulating the economy, we have to mention the staggering achievements of the National Institute of Health. More than 80 Nobel Prizes have been awarded for NIH-supported research. And bear in mind, too, that unless basic research in biomedical sciences is funded by the federal government, most of it simply won't get done. Why? Because this basic research is basic. It may not lead to something. A lot of it leads to dead ends. But the basic research is done. The applied research is built on that. The private sector then comes in, adapts it for drugs and interventions, and we spur the economy, and we make people healthier. The economic impact of NIH has been profound. Take one example, the Human Genome Project, the human genome, mapping and sequencing the entire human gene. The federal government invested $3.8 billion in mapping and sequencing the human gene. Just last month, the Battelle Memorial Institute issued a report on the economic impact of the genomic revolution launched by this project. Battelle estimates that as of 2010, the return on investment of the project, $3.8 billion, return on investment totaled $796 billion. The project had created an estimated 310,000 jobs and $244 billion in personal income. In 2010 alone, just 1 year, the project generated $67 billion in economic output. Federal government, folks. Federal government did that. So in light of these statistics and the historical record that I've just cited going clear back to the founding of our republic, it is absurd to claim that the federal government cannot play a positive and even a profound role in boosting the economy, in spurring innovation, in creating jobs, and improving the standard of living of our people. Republicans protest that federal investments in innovation and research are about the government, quote, picking winners and losers. I hear that all the time. The truth is that initiatives like the Human Genome Project are not about picking winners and losers. That's making all of us winners. It's about the federal government stepping up to the plate to undertake big, important national projects that the private sector is simply not equipped to do. At times of crisis, such as during the Great Depression, and in the aftermath of the financial meltdown of 2008, the federal government has acted boldly to rescue the economy when the private sector was flat on its back and unable to function normally. The Recovery Act, passed by Congress soon after President Obama took office, has manifestly succeeded in jump-starting economic activity. Listen to all my Republican friends, they say, oh, the Recovery Act failed, it failed, it failed, it failed. Well, according to the Congressional Budget Office, Through the end of 2010, the Recovery Act raised the real inflation-adjusted gross domestic product by as much as 3.5%, increased the number of employed Americans by as many as 3.3 million. But today, the shot in the arm provided by the Recovery Act is winding down. Quite frankly, Madam President, we did not put enough in the Recovery Act to stretch it out for a longer period of time. The economy is still struggling. Our Democratic majority in this body has brought to the floor a series of job-creating bills, but Republicans have filibustered and killed every single one. So I repeat, yes, we face a large budget deficit. Yes, we have to address it in the medium and long term, but in the intermediate and long term, in the immediate term, we need to confront the jobs deficit. But we also face a deficit, I said, of a positive vision. A positive vision. We have failed to meet the challenges of our day with the boldness and the vision that our predecessors summoned in times past. Madam President, how much time do I have remaining?
10 minutes.
Indeed, many Republicans...
10 minutes remains for the Democratic side collectively.
I'll just take about 3 more minutes. Many Republicans are demanding that we permanently hobble the federal government, just as their predecessors didn't want to build the roads and the highways and the canals in the past. My friend from Utah had a chart there that said broke or balanced, broke or balanced. They claim our nation is poor and broke. That's not true. That's not true. That negative, defeatist viewpoint is dead wrong. We remain the wealthiest nation on earth. We have the highest per capita income of any major country on the face of the globe. But we have to act decisively with the power of the federal government to boost the economy, foster innovation, and create good middle-class jobs. That is the most important thing. And lastly, balanced budget. Let's just do what we know what we did under the Clinton years, in which we had 4 years of balanced budgets and left the biggest surplus in our nation's history. But the Republicans won't do that because they have a defeatist attitude. Well, we need a more bold vision than what the Republicans are offering to the American people.